Hi there, everybody. My name is Dawn Kalea, and I'm the editor of Report on Business magazine at the Globe and Mail. Thanks so much for being here today. I'll be your moderator for this morning's session on women and the economy. We know the COVID-19 pandemic has disproportionately affected women, knocking down their participation in the labor force from what was a historic high to its lowest level in over 3 decades. More than 1.5 million women lost their jobs in the first 2 months of the recession alone. Culprit being twofold. Industries typically dominated by women have been among the hardest hit by pandemic shutdowns, and women overwhelmingly bore the brunt of caregiving duties when schools and daycares closed. It's not an exaggeration to say the past nearly 20 months have represented a massive threat to gender equality in Canada, especially among marginalized women. To talk more about this, we've assembled 3 fantastic panelists, and I'll introduce them to you right now. First, we have Dr. Lindsey Teds, an associate professor of economics and the scientific director of fiscal and economic policy at the University of Calgary School of Public Policy. Her research focuses on Canadian tax policy, public economics, and public policy design and implementation using transdisciplinary and intersectional research lenses. Welcome. Next up, we have Dr. Tammy Sherrill, whose research focuses on women's labor market experiences, caregiving, retirement, and health. She's a professor of economics at Wilfrid Laurier University and fellow in residence with the C.D. Howe Institute. Welcome, Tammy. Finally, we have Catherine Scott, a senior researcher with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives and director for the CCPA's gender equality and public policy work. She has worked in the community sector as a researcher, writer, and advocate for the past 25 years, writing on a range of social and economic policy issues. Thank you all so much for being here. We greatly appreciate it. Before we start off, I'd just like to note that we'll be able to take a few questions toward the end of the hour, so start queuing them up now if you're so inclined. And as for our panelists, to get us started, I'd love each of you to spend a minute or two just talking about the work you do and how your focus shifted at the start of the pandemic. You know, what did you start to see as it began to take hold? Lindsey, let's start with you.
Yeah, well, I mean, as a mom to a young school-aged child, the pandemic really hit me when suddenly on March 20th, a Sunday at 5 p.m., the government announced that it was closing all schools to face-to-face learning. So while I had been watching the cases unfold, and it was very clear that some actions were going to be taken. When that announcement was made, that's when I really felt it. You know, we here in Alberta were closed to all schools for about 2 weeks, 2 or 3 weeks, and then schools shifted to online learning. My son was in grade 1 at the time. And while I may be a professor, I'm not a grade 1 teacher. So the entire last half of 2020 is a big blur to me. Like many women of young kids, I was struggling. I had a lot of obligations at the university. We were managing several hours of online school. And I was hearing across the board, not only amongst my peers, but also through a variety of boards and discussion forums that I follow, how much women particularly were struggling. And what I found very early on in the pandemic was, you know, getting people to understand how much of a burden we were putting on women with respect to unpaid caregiving that the governments were just expecting us to do. There was no please or thank you, or nobody banged pots and pans for us or anything like that. And it was just expected that we would drop everything in order to engage in unpaid caregiving. And that really surprised me. I know it shouldn't, but the degree of which it happened, especially here in Alberta, which doesn't seem to really understand the real economic contribution that women make, it just blew me away. And this is where I immediately started talking about the impact of the pandemic on women. And I'll turn it over maybe to Tammy from here for her to talk about the same thing, but it really was first and foremost a lived experience that influenced how I was viewing the pandemic.
Right. Tammy?
Yeah, so I think I share a lot of experience there with Lindsey. I remember March 12th being our last normal day here in Ontario, that the kids went to school and, we all came back home, and then we were all sent home after that. And so for me, having an elementary school age child at home, a shift worker spouse who was going in and out of quarantine on a regular basis, and other sorts of things in our own household was a huge juggling act to take on. But at the same time, feeling very privileged that I was among those people who could go home and perform that juggling act. So it was kind of a mixed feeling there that I think a lot of women would have been having at the time. Now, in my job, I'm a labor economist. I spend most of my time watching the labor market data and paying attention to income support programs. And so that expertise also became very high demand, with a lot of people asking for, some of my time just to try and bring some input to the table. And so we spent a lot of time just trying to sort out which numbers to pay attention to in the labor market. The usual labor market statistics looking at unemployment were completely irrelevant as soon as people can't search for work, right? This is a number that didn't mean anything anymore. So we needed to shift how we were looking at the labor market, tracking what's going on, and then trying to very, very quickly shape up some programs that were going to be feasible and fast moving in government, which is something that never happens, right? So we were by mid-April looking at jobs plummeting, and we had 8 million people applying for CERB by the third week of April, and then trying to figure out how things were going to move going forward. And so that certainly kept us all very, very busy for a few months after that as well.
Catherine?
Busy for the last 18, 20 months. I guess a tad older than both of you. And when when it hit in March, I'm based in Ottawa. I had university-aged children. My daughter lost her last of her fourth year. There was, the crisis getting kids home, her friends who couldn't get out of the country. Like, it was just, as you both know, it would have been chaos on university campuses, and how was the school year going to end? I guess on the other side, I had a father in long-term care, and that just all of a sudden shifted everything, and how as a family that had to navigate those care responsibilities and what happened to him, that just it blew everything or pushed everything aside. So that was my immediate spring. And at work, we are a nonprofit research think tank. We're based in Ottawa with different offices across the country. It was very clear, effectively, it was down. It was everything was put down. We immediately shifted gears. Everybody was, turned outward, tracking, as Tammy was talking about, trying to make sense of what was the information we had. Certainly mobilizing the research and the policy and work that we had done previously to look at the moment. And it felt, really a crisis, like who was being impacted? What were they going to be served by existing programs? What did we need to put in the window to make sure that, huge numbers of people that would never have qualified for EI, who were desperately, being impacted, what was going to be put in place? And it really was this kind of emergency moment. Everybody was working full tilt. It felt it just really stepping into this moment where it was like policy in real time. I've never experienced it in my career, that kind of moment where it really mattered to engage publicly, because we were crafting policy solutions on the fly and putting them up, and like having massive consequences in people's lives. It was an extraordinary time. So going forward, certainly we're living with the legacy of that. So, and I would argue still acute pressures, particularly on women and marginalized women, like graphic disparities, and similarly graphic disparities in the recovery.
So let's talk about, why women were hit so hard. Let's just, dive in. Whoever wants to start. Lindsey, say.
Yeah, well, when we started seeing international travel shut down as Europe sort of went into its first wave, this was in like late January, early February. This is where, again, I'm a bit weird in some of the pieces of information that I sort of scan. And what I found interesting was in February, before Canada was really even talking about this being a big economic wave coming at us, I was already seeing on the job boards women in the hospitality sector, in tourism, in the restaurant and bar industry, in accommodations, they were being laid off. And that was sort of the first indication for me, mid-February, that we needed to really, this was going to be different. This wasn't going to be the 2008 financial collapse. This was a completely different economic shock that was happening. And it was going to affect sectors that are not normally affected first in a wave like that. And it also became quite clear as countries around the world were struggling with schools. Are schools a source of spread? How do we keep schools safe? All of that kind of stuff. It again, the early indicators were that this was different and it was going to hit women very, very hard. One of the, two reasons for that. One, the sectors that we are in were the sectors that were being hit first and foremost. And in fact, were hit very hard. Yes, the men eventually caught up, but it was the female-dominated sectors where the employment hits were early, and they lasted a lot longer as well. And then the schools, the whole debate about schools. In the previous session, it was said, we now need to make sure that schools are the last to close and the first to open. And that is something that we are going to have to take forward. We will have many more pandemics in my lifetime. That is what is being predicted by the scientific community. So we need to learn from this. And it is the management of the schools that help us manage the economic impact on women. And that is because while millennial men are coming into the fold and taking on more caregiving responsibilities, the predominant amount of caregiving is in fact still done by women. We still have a very differential workload in the household. And I think also what hit women, we'll have a panel later on about mental health. One of the aspects that very much affected women, and I think that we're going to find that this was the driver of women dropping out of the labor force, was the sheer magnitude of emotional labor that we were taking on. We were the ones who were worrying about what are the caseloads in school? When are the schools going to shut down? Do I have enough masks? Have I done laundry enough so that my son has masks? Do we have to get tested? When is the vaccine going to roll out? Is everybody safe and healthy? I know that weighed on me on a daily basis, and it never felt like my day ended. It started in a panic and trying to make sure everybody was safe and healthy. And it was the last thing that I was dealing with at night before going to bed. So, you went from working maybe 8 hours a day on the job and maybe 2 in the home, and it was just constant. And so we need to make sure that we have a better understanding of mental health and the burden that falls onto women, particularly in these kinds of times. And make sure that we have the supports there. I'm very lucky to have, mental health support through my employer, but I am, most people do not. And it is very costly to access those services. So we really absolutely need to rethink our supports for people, because again, this is not going to be the first one. There's many more to come, and we need to be better prepared for the next one. So that's why I think it was much harder on women, because of everything we do take on, and everybody forgets that emotional labor, which really does fall to us.
Right. Tammy, what did you see from your perch at Wilfrid Laurier?
Well, I think it's important to emphasize just how different this is as a recession from past recessions. If you were to look at any of, say, the past 3 major recessions in terms of who lost jobs, for every woman who lost a job, there were 4 men. And that tended to reflect which industries were hit. So thinking of construction and manufacturing in past recessions as being key industries there. But more recently, when we look at where what happened this past year, it's much more evenly split between the jobs that were lost, with women's jobs representing a slightly larger share than men's. And just the fact that the service sector was so hard hit is what makes that so very, very different. I worry, however, that we overstate the extent to which industries were closing explains the fact that women had more job losses than men. Because even when you look within industry and occupation categories, you see that more women were losing their jobs than men were. Okay, so within accommodation and food, within manufacturing, more women were leaving their jobs. And part of that is going to reflect their ability to negotiate some flexibility in their jobs relative to some of the men. But then, as Lindsey was saying, a large part of that is reflecting these other responsibilities that women were having to take on. I've had a chance to pick apart the data a little bit more on that. And even after controlling for, which industries people are in, what education levels are, all these sorts of things, you still saw that moms with kids in that age group of 6 to 12 were much, much less likely than dads with those same kids to be leaving their jobs. And that was an even much larger impact when you look at people working in those hospitality industries, hospitality and tourism types of industries, and especially among women who had lower wage opportunities. So typically those without post-secondary education, they were hit even harder by those school closures and just the uncertainty in managing childcare throughout the past year and a half. That's still an ongoing type of uncertainty that's there. And so all of those factors played a big role. And I think that caregiving responsibility underpins so much of what we see in that gender difference and who is impacted in jobs.
It's interesting, I think, when we've been parsing labor statistics and so forth to look at who actually left the labor market, the impact is proportionate job losses. It's also true that women scaled back their hours, and we see that in the data as well, right? They didn't leave it, they were actually radically scaling back, and that happened across industries and occupations. We don't have terrific data in Canada that really captured that. I mean, we've seen some of the other international studies in the UK, for instance, that was much better at sort of capturing that dynamic. Surveys looking at even for parents that when their kids came home, who was the person actually navigating school, who was doing those tasks. And you saw a huge, if you're looking at unpaid work, the gap, which is already significant, and honesty before going into the pandemic was fairly significant, that widened even more. So we have some data certainly from the UK and the US talking about that. There's no reason to think it wasn't true in Canada. And a lot of the polling data, the surveys that StatScan, the crowdsourced data they did, indicated this as well. It really marked among marginalized families that didn't have the option and certainly weren't working at home. Stories of families keeping their kids home, living in high rises because they were fearful about sending their kids. They didn't want them using the elevators. It's extraordinary how differentially the experience of this pandemic was, depending on where you were and the resources you had at your command to navigate this, the chaos. And so many families had nothing. And obviously are still paying the price. And the statistic that really grabbed me was looking at what happened to single moms. And this wasn't in the papers. It's shocking that, all these families, or even, the families that were coping with elder care and all of the rest of it. But the single parents, they disappeared. You just locked them off the labor. You were in lockdown. They couldn't access support from their maybe older family members that might have been helping out. You were not to engage with other households. What were those women to do? And so they had no choice but to step back and, rely on emergency benefits. But their drop in employment hours was precipitous, the largest of any of the groups that I saw, and still large. This past summer, 2021, if you look at lone parent families, they're still working upwards of it was in July, 46% fewer hours than they were compared to February 2020. What is that? It speaks to the lack of support that we put in place. I completely agree with Lindsey. There was a massive gap in the pandemic response. And the whole thing was women, who are the natural shock absorbers in the economy, they were basically said, suck it up, buttercup. This is your game. And that's really quite effectively what happened. Varied, of course, according to province, but that was pretty much the theme of the pandemic. It's up to you.
Tammy, did you want to jump in there?
Yeah, there was two things to highlight. The first was that I will credit Matt Lundy at the Globe and Mail for taking some time to think about those single parents. I remember working with him on an article there. And there was actually an interesting difference there between the single parent who is truly single and has never been married and the parents who were divorced, because you could see divorced parents managing to juggle this a little bit better in terms of sharing. You had somebody to juggle with was really the key thing in that equation. And for a lot of single parents, there's just no options. And so they had to leave. I wanted to emphasize, though, one thing that we haven't focused on, and that's who kept their jobs at very, very high risk. And those were also predominantly women in many industries, whether it be in long-term care, healthcare, in a lot of those services that we like to think of as essential heroes for a little while. Those were really high-risk jobs. They became very high risk with still very, very low pay. And I think that's understated. Also recognizing that within a lot of those jobs, very much racialized women who were experiencing that higher risk as well. So, if we look at just the job losses, that mattered a lot, but also in terms of the risk that was being held by a lot of those women who remained, I think that's worth paying a bit more attention to.
I'm interested in talking a little bit about the sort of income supports that were put in place and how they affected, women versus men through all of this. Does anybody? Lindsey?
Oh, sorry. Yeah. So, one of the things that we're looking at is, Tammy's now just talking about how the individuals who were predominantly women who didn't really have the choice, like their sector didn't shut down. It was incredibly high risk. We had these, I'm not sure, sorry. We had these programs roll out. One of the downsides to the programs was historically, in order to get access to employment insurance or what have you, you can't have voluntarily left your job. And while we had this language similar for the CERB and the CRB, it was always you couldn't have your job had to have been lost due to COVID. What I'm working with Chris McCabe at the University of Alberta to sort of disentangle some of these effects, because we didn't see individuals benefit from the CERB and the CRB who are working in these high risk sectors. And it looks like this historical idea of you can't voluntarily leave your job impacted the knowledge and understanding of individuals as to whether or not they could leave their job during the pandemic because of the health risks, and ensure that they could access these programs. So one of the things that I don't think has been discussed enough with these job protection programs that were in place for the pandemic was how much knowledge and understanding you had to have about how different these programs were and how you could benefit from them because your health was at risk. And I think we actually really missed an opportunity there in terms of communicating it properly to those individuals who could have walked away from a very, very risky job, including at the meatpacking plants here in Calgary. We had massive outbreaks in what are historically not safe work environments, and that could have benefited from them. I have a member on my research team who's racialized and actually knows a lot of the individuals who were working in these aspects, and even he didn't know that the CERB and the CRB could have benefited individuals who were terrified, really absolutely scared to go to work because they were worried they were going to bring the virus home to their family, to their children, their extended family, and so forth. So I think there is a lot to learn. I think, again, what we did in terms of unrolling those supports as quickly as we did, we really should applaud the public servants and the experts that were involved in that. But we also absolutely have to learn what we didn't do properly. And that is we have to better understand benefit delivery historically and ensure that benefit delivery during pandemic times covers people appropriately, and don't leave it to individuals to read between the lines as to whether or not they can risk their entire income stream and attempt to get access to these benefits.
Right. Catherine, when we spoke earlier, you said that COVID had ripped open the social safety net and exposed where the booby traps are. Can you talk a little bit to that? I thought that was quite striking.
Well, we talk about COVID as being a great revealer, but quite frankly, there was nothing new about patriarchy or racism or systemic inequality. What COVID did was obviously really revealed in a graphic way how these types of inequalities are baked into our programming and our institutions and so forth, because obviously it just played out in Technicolor. And that's true with our social safety net. I mean, it revealed all the flaws. EI was not up to the task. I mean, the government pivoted on a dime. It was completely clear by week 2. This was not the institution that is EI would fail miserably, and they pivoted and had to come up with, obviously, they came up with the SERB, and we can debate the delivery and the timing and the cues. Like, there's a lot to unpack in there. But as Lindsey said, the public servants, they turned on a dime and they came up with an incredibly important program that, let's be clear, Canada was actually among peer countries, has flowed a lot of money to households and businesses to keep things afloat this past year. Like, it was something like 14.6% of GDP. Was one of the highest. And what was interesting, it was also one of the only countries that flowed money to households, either through the one-time transfers or, the ongoing emergency benefits. And I was looking at some, like, StatsCan estimated what poverty might have been had we not done this based on market. They were saying it was going to be 40% last year. Like, it was just extraordinary with it. When the bottom dropped out of the low-wage labor market, it would have been catastrophic. And as it was, pandemic benefits, reduced levels of poverty they estimate around 17% at the beginning of 2021. I mean, we'll come back when the real data, that's a problem in Canada. Of course, all our data there's a bit of a lag, but, the estimates were really powerful. So it was an incredible, that whole experience illustrated the graphic failings and the graphic potential. And Lindsey was talking about what we can learn from this. And there's gazillion lessons to learn ongoing, certainly as it pertains to women. SERB was interesting because, and I remember being struck, as distinct from the CRB, because it was obviously available to folks who, they had to have labor market attachment. We can talk about who SERB missed, and like a bunch of people SERB missed. But SERB itself, but they also targeted folks with up to $1,000 of earnings. That was one of the revisions they brought in. That huge number of precarious workers, the people that would not have been captured by EI, self-employed workers, majority women, right? Those people in those income brackets earning up to $1,000 a month. So it really captured that. It didn't have a family income test. It was actually directed to individual workers. So women were not excluded from emergency benefits if they lived in a household who had a spouse where there was a big differential in incomes. Really important. It delivered a flat benefit of $500 a month, or no, $500 a week. And that's a level of benefit many of those families would never have seen on EI. So it really was a powerful program in sustaining and supporting families, and really worked for women in ways better than our current income security system does. And so really, I hope SERB opened the door to not only, like Lindsey's talking about, looking at like the need for income security in situations where your health is at risk. It opened the door to thinking about caregiving and income security differently, because caregiving is not a reason to get EI, right? Like, it's not, you can't say, I'm having trouble with my childcare arrangements. I need to, and I don't have paid leave from my employer. Can I apply? You can't do that. So it opened the window to doing things differently, caregiving, and it really pointed the direction of where we should be going with EI reform, certainly, but other income security reform down the road.
Tammy, do you want to pop in on this?
Well, I think there's a ton of things that we could unpack there. So it's more about where to focus, I think is the bigger issue. So what happened when we brought in CERB was we realized just how many, or highlighted, I think is a better word to say, just how many people contribute to our EI system, but can never get anything back from it, right? There's a lot of part-time workers whose hours just simply do not add up to meet the normal eligibility requirements. And that's why we needed something that just said, look, if you've had some income in the past year, you had to meet some threshold, you can be part of this system. But also that if you were that part-time worker and lost your job, even if you got 55% of what you used to earn, that's not going to help you cover those bills that needed to be covered. So that made people think a little bit harder about what that base level of benefits should really look like, and what would be afforded to a lot of our part-time workers. And then of course there's the self-employment issue, which is an interesting problem because where we have seen special benefits being offered to self-employed workers, they aren't taking it up. They aren't wanting to make those contributions. The program that we have right now for sickness and maternity and parental leave benefits for the self-employed is effectively a shell program. Nobody signs up for it. Nobody pays into it. So this highlights just how complicated it might be to actually start up and try to modify these programs. And as we go forward, we're trying to look for ways where we might better cover these variety of circumstances without substantially altering employment relationships by building a bigger and different EI system. And I don't think I want to pretend that that's an easy thing to do either. So we're entering this new phase where we're trying to find better ways to cover a larger group of people. I think the one that has been remaining to be left out that I think is worth paying more attention to are those folks who would have been re-entering the labor market throughout this pandemic. So what I have in mind is somebody who had young children. They may have planned on coming back to jobs, finding new jobs again, but then a pandemic hits, they're at home with the kids, and this is just simply not an option anymore. EI would not have supported them in the past. It will not in the future. And I think that's probably the big gaps to pay attention to in that system.
I'd like to talk a little bit about sort of the current moment and where we're at right now. We're in something of a K-shaped recovery. And what effect is that having on women? And particularly, marginalized women.
So perhaps I could just start by saying that the K-shaped recovery is sort of a term that came into the media in the United States sometime in the middle of last year. And it was this lovely graph going around that had no axis labels. So nobody knew exactly what that was supposed to mean and exactly who it was referring to. And unfortunately, that dismissed the conversation very quickly, because I think it was important to pay attention to the fact that there's pockets of people who may not show up in the big data, but there's pockets of people there who require attention with targeted policy initiatives focused on their particular issues and their circumstances. So I've tended to avoid the K-shaped recovery terminology because it is so quickly dismissed in aggregate numbers. But I think that one of the pockets there that I was just mentioning was this notion that there's a group of women who have taken on caregiving over the past year and a half and are continuing to do so, who are going to be struggling getting back into the labor market where they might have otherwise been there already. And I think that's one of those groups that is going to be slower to recover than the rest of the economy.
I mean, I also think that, hospitality is being slow to come back and might honestly never come back to the levels we've seen before. So where does that leave? Where does that leave us? Anybody want to jump in? Lindsey, Catherine?
No, sure. I take Tammy's point around using a metaphor like the K-shaped recovery. There obviously was evidence of a differential. I mean, it's not K-shaped anymore. Remember, Jim Stanford used the Loch Ness Monster. I think where we're at, I think that's an important question, and we're trying to parse that out. Clearly, the rush, the euphoria that was attached to having botched the reopening, obviously, last fall and last winter with graphic effect. And this idea, the euphoria, that we are coming out of the pandemic with the mass vaccination and the sober realization that we are not beyond the long shadow of this pandemic anytime soon. We see that obviously in the rising case numbers now. we're in a period of tremendous uncertainty. You know, we've locked the bottom of the labor market off. What industries are coming back. Clearly, you know, there's other big macro trends going on. There's been a real, one of the things in the data certainly is the exit of older workers, particularly older women over age 55. That's probably part of a trend toward, you know, obviously population aging, and a lot of women in that age bracket who decide, I'm done. Like, you know, if they had enough support or they had some benefits in their stock portfolio, if they were so privileged to have a stock portfolio, was doing well this past year, and they said, you know what, I'm going to leave now. I don't know if we don't know what's really going on right now, but clearly there's some big shifts happening. And whether the types of employment opportunities that will be there. You mentioned hospitality, and whether that never will come back to the level of employment, or perhaps not. Obviously, automation, the pandemic has advanced that in sectors like retail and hospitality. So I think we're in a really period of profound shift, and obviously ongoing discussion about job vacancies and lagging wage growth. You know, obviously the current discussion about inflation and how that will take a bite out of household incomes and cost of living, runaway housing, shelter costs in many, increasing number of Canadian communities. So it's really, it's a moment. And I think coming back to women, again, that uncertainty, you know, it really undermines women's economic security. You know, like we rolled back through the pandemic, like when women left the labor market, we lopped 20 years off of women gender equality in the labor market. Like labor force participation rates have been rolled back to the 90s and beyond. And you know how flexible that is. I think it's a real concern. And what are the policy and, you know, what do we need to be doing right now to address this level of uncertainty? We've just removed the emergency benefits. I mean, these will become really pressing questions as people move into the winter. And if, you know, job recovery doesn't accelerate, you know, I think there's going to be a lot of economic stress.
I'll just pick up on a few themes there and start it off by talking about how much narrative matters. I live in a province where our Minister of Jobs actually came out and said women took time off during the pandemic. And that is his narrative of what happened to women in the labor market in Alberta, is that they took time off. Our politicians cannot be looking at this data and take that kind of theme away. We were dramatically hit. We didn't take time off. And the long-term consequences of this, as Catherine just said, is important. In particular, when, you know, if we're having a separation of the labor market because of the pandemic for 2 or 3 years, this affects our ability to afford our retirement, and again relegates women into poverty in retirement as a result of not having that ability to either accrue CPP credits or save for their own retirement, or having to have drawn them down in order to have taken this time off. So I really want to make sure that we do understand that narrative matters. And that narrative also matters for older women and childcare. I see too many individuals saying we do not need to have a full public system of early childhood education because the grandparents can take care of the kids. The grandparents don't take care of the kids, it's the grandmother. And we're often talking about women 55 plus who can still have very strong labor market attachments, and there being this assumption that grandparents should just, you know, just leave the labor force and take care of their kids because early childhood education is not necessary infrastructure or a public program for both the short term and the long term. So again, that's another narrative that absolutely has to be dismantled as we're moving forward, as we continue to just assume women are here to do unpaid work that is absolutely necessary in order for us us to achieve a quality of life that we all seem to want to have for men. And this needs to be considered with respect to women. With the lack of programs going forward, one of the areas I've been spending a lot of time working in is income assistance or provincial welfare. Provincial welfare cannot be the program that is there to support individuals through all of these conditions. For the most part, income assistance is there for people with multiple barriers, people with disability. It barely, it certainly doesn't get you to poverty, and it is a very stigmatizing program. So we have to make sure that we don't think about income assistance as being there for a dramatic change in working conditions. And we know we're going to have a fifth wave, right? It's going to hit about February. It's going to be the result of, Christmas. We're still going to have waves moving forward. And the lack of programs that we have right now makes me very, very concerned about welfare being the only program to support individuals, because it is insufficient, it is highly stigmatizing, and it requires you to devolve yourself of almost every asset you have, and therefore makes you vulnerable to every single income shock that could possibly happen to you in the future. And so, I really want to reinforce how much narrative matters, and our politicians have to do a better job in terms of understanding what happened here and communicating it to not only themselves, but also to those of us who are deeply impacted by it.
Tammy, do you want to chime in?
Sure.
Here?
So thinking of this particular statement that Lindsey is mentioning, I have taken that many times now as a talking point in presentations. I happen to have it here, and said, what if we said a lot of men came back into the workforce in September because a lot of men took time off during COVID? It leaves this sense that this was simply a choice. We were all out at the cottage enjoying ourselves, and there is certainly no policy response involved or needed. And I think if you said that about men to the average family, it would not receive much of a positive response, right? That seems to be the obvious thing. And so this is where it changes, how do we think about policy responses here? And that is absolutely vital. It's, however, within the profession of economics, we do this all the time, where we shape a conversation about caregiving responsibilities and people needing to pull themselves out of the labor market in order to manage those. We treat that as some preference of women. This is just something we this is a lovely way to spend our time, and this is all that we want to do, as opposed to a constrained choice, as a matter of, these are the options in front of us and what needs to be done. And that is something that we just need to change how we shape that conversation if we want to move forward on that in a meaningful way. That's, battling decades, centuries of, traditional norms and beliefs, but that takes time. But I think we're finally pushing on that point. So I think that is worth emphasizing here, that narrative that comes from the analysis of the data matters for how policy will move forward and how it gets shaped and prioritized. Maybe returning just a little bit to thinking about this K-shaped recovery and where things are going there, a lot of it is going to be restructuring the jobs that are out there, right? We're talking about hospitality, tourism, things like accommodations and food. A lot of those restaurants, frankly, need to go out of business. They normally would have gone out of business in normal times, right? It's an industry with high turnover, but now the nature of that work has changed. The nature of what people expect in their jobs has changed. And many of people have simply moved on to other parts of the economy. They found better work. And so, yes, there needs to be some increases in wages if people want them to take on those jobs. We have to recognize that some of those jobs aren't coming back, and maybe move towards thinking about how to get those folks into the jobs that would be coming forward in the future. That is the policy priority, and that's going to include many of those women who took time away over this past year and a half.
Can I hop in on this? The other group that I think we should, or other groups, because I think, as we said, this revealed how the inequities were baked into our system. Generally, we can think about people with disabilities and what the collapse of the capacity in the community sector meant to people with disabilities who also were laid off or in low-wage employment and are now not in a position necessarily to take those opportunities up again because the capacity in the community sector is so diminished through the pandemic and the instability of the way we organize services. So that creates insurmountable barriers. Or migrant care workers who were massively disadvantaged by the structure of our temporary work programs, bringing this in where migrant care workers effectively locked in the houses with their employers, or Indigenous workers. So I think Tammy's quite right. I think part of what we need to be thinking about as this post-pandemic economy takes shape, not only are we looking at the income security supports that need to be in place, but what are the labor market supports that need to be in place? What are the new labor employment standards that need to be in place to support marginalized workers that were hammered in this recession? So that that we are building back better. And again, these groups have been largely invisible in our ongoing discussion, and it really takes we need to give voice and tell their stories and understand the impact that it's had and how policies and programs impact, how they are impacted differently to help craft a more inclusive future and a more inclusive economic future.
So we know childcare is one of the social services that all of this hinges on. As of today, Ontario is sort of we believe the lone holdout here on the federal childcare plan. So who wants to jump in on that?
I'm happy to hear Lindsey's speculation on the Alberta announcement.
So we have, although I'm a bit hesitant to get too excited about the Alberta announcement. I'd like to see the details before we get too far on it. One of the things that I started to do a couple of years ago is not use just the word childcare, but early childhood education and childcare. The aspect of early childhood education is making sure that we have quality places to send our children where they are going to learn valuable skills. And yes, at that age, again, I'm a mom, I understand all of this stuff. Play-based learning is absolutely important, but we have to make sure that we understand that high quality child care where the child is cared for in a good, solid environment, and they're picking up as skills that will allow them to enter into the K through 12 system so that their teachers can actually focus on curriculum, means that we have to think about this as early childhood education. And as soon as we start doing that, we think of the system differently. The provinces that signed on to the federal government early childhood education and childcare deals were provinces that had shifted early childhood education into their Ministry of Education. And it showed that they really understood that we're really trying to set up a system here that is about a proper transition of kids from, the home environment into a play-based learning, into social skills, and then into the K through 12. You can talk to teachers in the K through 12 system who have to spend a lot of time working on social skills amongst the kids that didn't experience either high quality early childhood education or didn't even have access to, preschool or things like that. This is, in fact, a vital skill for kids. It is not just childcare, and we have to make sure that the individuals that are in that system. A lot of them have bachelor's degrees, and we're paying $15 an hour, if that, in what is I cannot understate how essential those workers are, how skilled they are. And we see over and over again how the market doesn't pay for care. It doesn't value it as a skill. And that, again, is the patriarchy at work. We have to make sure that we understand that, caring for children is, I mean, bless your hearts, all of you who do it. I can't do it full time. I love my son, and I love him more when I don't spend 15 hours a day with him. That is, my ability to allocate my skills appropriately, and others should have that same ability. But it is important care work. It is skilled care work. They need to be treated as such, and we need to make sure that we are remunerating that care. And you can extend that into long-term care homes as well. What happened in our long-term care homes is a result of the market not paying for care. They don't think that this is important. And so long-term care homes, cradle to grave, we do absolutely have to think about this as our system of social supports and how we think about structuring our institutions to ensure that we properly account for these skills and we remunerate them appropriately, and our work environments are such that we are also supporting those workers.
Right. Tammy, do you want to?
Yeah, so I think I wanted to emphasize the importance of having options in this conversation. And I think that really underpins, what we're talking about here. When we're looking at, this early learning and childcare issue, I think there's a group of people who really underappreciate the difference between having that ECE who has been to college or university and has a plan for that play-based type of learning, and the unemployed neighbor who sits your kid in front of YouTube, right? And a lot of women who have lower paying jobs are looking at only being able to afford that unemployed neighbor who sits your kid in front of YouTube. And if that's your choice, and taking that and then going to work, you might decide not to go. But if you had the option of sending your kid to a quality care daycare, then you would take that choice. But it's a matter of what your options are in front of you. As soon as you have good options, then you can decide for yourself, do I want to be the at-home parent because maybe you love doing that? I'm with Lindsey on that one. Or do I want to go and build a career and maybe even shape my education around building that career? A lot of young women right now are looking at whether or not they are going to have childcare options in front of them. If they do, it's worth investing in that education that gets them into those jobs that continue for an entire career, the next 20 to 40 years. If they don't, they know that they're going to be facing a huge interruption there. Is it worth investing in that human capital right now? Maybe not. So we're totally underutilizing the skills that we have in our economy if we don't have that good early learning childcare option available to those individuals who might want to make use of it. So there's a big long-term problem here. It's not just that immediate problem of being a young family and trying to afford childcare. We're talking about women who are building their entire careers around whether or not quality care is an option for them in that stage of their career, where building up your career is so absolutely vital and important. That's where we see all these big wage gaps show up for women, right? It's the moment they become parents and have to do that juggling act through their career for those several years, many years, right? Until the kids are old enough to start taking care of themselves a little bit more. And until we fix that part of the problem, we're not going to get rid of the wage gaps. We're not going to get rid of all these differentials. And everything that we saw come out in this pandemic is just going to repeat itself over and over and over again.
I suspect Catherine might want to add to this.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I can tell you the childcare community was on pins and needles to see the outcome of the election and whether we would be waiting many more years. We've been working for a universal childcare system for 50 plus years from the Royal Commission back in the day with from 1970. And, one of the things that obviously the pandemic has done, it's opened the window to building, obviously with the historic announcement of the $30 billion investment in a universal program. And the excitement attached to that childcare would finally be seen in this as the essential public service that it is, that our market-based approach to childcare had failed miserably. And it's not, we don't really want private businesses in the business of organizing our care services because we have great evidence that the care provided in those settings is substandard, and that's been graphically revealed, obviously, in the long-term care sector in provinces like Ontario, where you have majority where the death of seniors in privately run long-term care facilities was much higher than that in nonprofit or public facilities. So, this is a moment where we can build an appropriately publicly managed, publicly funded childcare system that recognizes the contribution of the ECE workers, their skill, and really, we can get it right. So there's lots of excitement attached to that. I think it's a long road ahead. I don't know what these agreements, when we have some of the agreements right now, the funding tools we've used in the past, federal transfers to the provinces haven't really appreciably shifted the needle on the quality of childcare and or its distribution. Obviously childcare deserts, how whether care is available for non-standard workers or unique care that's needed for kids with special needs or in the Indigenous communities. So this is an opportunity, and hopefully the federal government will be striking deals that have strong national standards and engaged implementation plans that really we are able to monitor and track and really start to move the needle on creating a public system. That's the opportunity that's in front of us. And that's the model, that hopefully this will model what needs to happen in long-term care. We really need to start moving some of these pieces. And, all of which have been mired in FedProv, discussions of responsibility. And, is this the hill we're dying on? Well, it is the hill that people are dying on. In our refusal to actually tackle care infrastructure and make investments in the care economy that are meaningful, significant for women, but the people receiving care. So I am very excited about this moment, and my hat's off to the community that has driven this home, the parents across the country, that this, hopefully this will be Canada's moment to move ahead, because, we're laggards. Again, I'm just talking the comparative perspective. Canada is quite behind the 8 ball on where we are in terms of investment in our early childhood education, where we are in investment in training. There's any number of areas we need to be paying attention to right now to make sure we have a gender just recovery.
So we've just got 3 minutes left here. I'd like to just hit each of you in a bit of a lightning round. One most crucial policy change that you would like to see based on lessons we've learned from this pandemic. Lindsey, I'll start with you. 30 seconds.
We need to update our disability policies to make sure that we account for long COVID and the ongoing long-term experiences of individuals, many of whom are women, who will need disability supports for the rest of their lives.
Tammy?
Obviously, childcare is there, but I think I would add that we desperately need a program that adequately addresses emergency needs for people who do not qualify for EI in the long run. Just having that gap stop, I'm not sure that's the right word, but something to fill that gap for when people do need some short-term assistance that is needed.
Is this the moment for universal basic income?
No.
Right at the end.
We can't start that now. I'll turn it over to Kathy.
A whole other panel. Okay.
No, I don't think it's the time for a universal basic income. I think it's the time to complete Canada's social safety net with the missing pillars that would constitute an income guarantee for people across the age spectrum, going hard on working age folks, those without kids in particular, suffering extraordinarily deep levels of poverty, going hard on disability benefits. That is a massive, that is a transformational policy initiative. And going hard on investments in the care economy. We're not getting any younger. It's a critical investment that will benefit everyone across the board.
Look, we have a minute and a half left. Does anybody have any final words they want to? I won't lob any grenades into the conversation again.
I'm looking forward to seeing the collection that's coming out on the Panda Society. I think some of you have contributed to that, and I think it'll be a roadmap Obviously the work of the task force on gender and economy is ongoing. I think that's interesting. I would recommend it become permanent. I'm not sure whether Minister Freeland she's not on the call, but I would hope that she might consider making it permanent, because this is an issue that demands that kind of sustained attention. That's certainly what Jennifer was highlighting at the earlier panel. We need to be bringing a gender lens to all of our policy development work. It's just critical.
Mm-hmm. I think
I'd say in terms of what we're seeing in the labor market right now, as individuals are talking about quote unquote shortages, really what we've seen, I think, is hopefully a shift in power. Employers just had way too much power, especially at the lower wage sectors. And I think it is time for a shift. And I think employees are actually showing their ability to understand what happened during this pandemic and demand better from their employers. And we should applaud that.
Unfortunately, I'm going to have to leave it there. We've gone right to time. Dr. Lindsey Teds, Dr. Tammy Sherrill, and Catherine Scott, thank you so much for being here. This was a fantastic discussion. I really appreciate it.
Thanks,
Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.